That was never the goal. The goal was never for them to have a place where they could live. The goal was for Jewish people to never have a place where they could live. That was always the goal. And is an Islamist issue. And this is why in the Hamas charter, they specifically talk about this. And this is why in Iran, for example, they will scream, death to Israel, death to America. This is why you'll hear the same swearing at Yahud everywhere, not just in the Arab world, but in Pakistan and Indonesia and in countries that they have Islam, but they don't have any history. They don't have any connection to the Arab world, but it comes through in the religion. The religion, as I mentioned in my book, hates all non-Muslims, but of course, there is a special extra vicious hate for Jewish people.
You're right.
So my dad is from Gaza, and he went to Egypt when Gaza was under Egyptian rule, and he was able to go to university there, and that's where he met my mom. And the two of them moved to the States. They moved to San Francisco, in fact, and now we're talking like late 60s, so it's the peace, love, and hippie era. And my dad got really pulled into all this. My mom was secular, open-minded, educated woman as well at the time. And my dad got really pulled into the, peace, love, and hippie era. And my mom did not. She thought it was all very just debauchery and, hedonism. And eventually their marriage fell apart. They had moved to Vancouver. That's where I was born, Vancouver, Canada. Their marriage fell apart. And my mom was alone now with 3 kids. My dad had moved to the other side of Canada, to Montreal, eventually got remarried, new kids, started his whole life all over again. Now, what's interesting to note here is during that time, Hassan al-Banna, you might be aware of the grandfather of the Muslim Brotherhood. Was like Sayyid Qutb was one of the authors who was really famous at this time of like the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. And he would always talk about how American people, American culture, Western civilization, democracy, capitalism, all of these, liberalism, feminism, all of these ideas were very they were like toxic and poisonous for the world. And he hated the Western world so much. And he connected that with a pro-Islam, as in Islam is the answer. Islam huwa al-hal, which means Islam is the answer to all of these ills in America. Well, that just clicked with my mom because she blamed America for being the reason why her marriage fell apart, the reason why her husband left. And so she really glommed on to the anti-West side of things, and then the pro-Islam side of things just kind of like is part of the package. And she became a student at Al-Azhar University, a scholar, in fact, at Al-Azhar University. She became the head of the Islamic Studies department at the Islamic School, hook, line, and sinker, like a born-again Muslim, I guess you would call her. And this was a brand of Islam which was very political. So it was not about personal faith, but it's certainly an ideology about spreading Islam through the globe in order to save humanity from the debauchery of being infidels. And that is the mom that around 5 or 6 years old for me, that's when she kind of flipped into this, started wearing hijab. She married an Islamist man who would beat us if we didn't pray 5 times a day, study the Quran. We started going to Islamic schools. We were taken out of public schools. My sister and I were put into hijab as well. Everything became haram. Everything became forbidden. Suddenly, birthdays were haram. Music is haram. Riding a bike is haram. Swimming is haram. Everything was forbidden. And if you can imagine like a 6-year-old girl, these are all the joys, right? I can't play with my non-Muslim friends anymore. I can't swim. I can't ride my bike. I can't have a birthday party. Like these are the joys of a kid. So I was obviously very unhappy about this whole situation, but there was nothing I could do because I was a child and I was getting beaten if I didn't listen. And not only that, I would burn in hell if I didn't listen as well. And so this man that my mom married came into our lives. And one of the first things that he did was take my mom's records. She used to listen to a lot of country music. So we had a lot of Dolly Parton, Kenny Rogers, Hank Williams. He would take her records and break them with us sitting down on the carpet in front of him. And he'd hand the shards to us and say, break these because these are from the devil. And I remember feeling just complete shock and confusion because this man just walked into our house and is breaking my mom's things, and she's just standing there letting him. And I couldn't understand it because if my brother had walked into my room and started breaking my Barbies, like I would react, but my mom had zero reaction. She was just letting him break her things. And so that was kind of the message to us all at that point, like, he is in control now. Your mom has left the building. And that was our lives. And then, as you mentioned, eventually I got forced into that marriage with the Al-Qaeda terrorist at 19, but that was after a long stint of many, many times trying to get me to toe the line. And eventually my mom said she had to find someone who was, quote, strong enough to control me. So he was chosen specifically because, I was that girl that still wanted to have non-Muslim friends. You know what I mean? I didn't want to be physically abused by the man that she married. So I had told my teacher about what was going on, and he wrote the foreword to my book.
Right. So
He
before
still
we
remembers it all.
some of the political aspects of all of this for our own lives, can you just tell us how it is that you got the strength, got the, I don't know, I can't think of the right word, but the self-confidence, maybe, given that you'd been beaten down, to literally leave that life?
Well, that was until many, many, many years later, and it was 100% my daughter. So when I was married to that terrorist, I ended up getting pregnant and having a daughter with him. And for any parents in the listening to this, you'll remember when you first have that first baby, that feeling of overwhelming love and wanting to protect and keep this baby as happy as possible. And I knew that there was no way, there was no way that I was going to allow my little girl to live the life that I was living. And that I needed to find a way to protect her, especially since her father and my mother were talking about taking her to Egypt and getting FGM performed on her, which was something so heinous that I hadn't even experienced it. My mom hadn't experienced it. It wasn't part of our family tradition, but it was part of his family. And my mom did not at all protect, defend anything. She was just like immediately like, yep, that's the right thing to do. That's the Islamically correct thing to do. And my family failed for not doing it to me. And I failed that I didn't do it to my daughters, but we're going to correct course and we'll make sure that it gets done to my granddaughter. And so because of that and many other reasons, I just knew I had to save my daughter from that environment.
So had still tremendous courage because in an environment like that, people are traumatized and that leads often to they're being immobilized, right? But you've taken it beyond that. And maybe you can go from what you've described as your personal experience to how do you see this as a threat on our society? The title we've given your talk, it's a threat for everybody. How do you see that?
It is absolutely a threat for everybody in the same way that it was a threat for me. But I think the difference is I was acutely aware of the threat that was in front of me. I got to live this life where I could see feminism outside my window. I could see liberalism outside my window. I could see freedom outside my window. And I understood that what I was living was the opposite of that. Unfortunately, what's going on now is there's such a muddying of the water. There's such a confusion that we're actually supporting, celebrating, and uplifting these barbaric, archaic, violent, terrorist ideals. And we are opening the doors wide for the barbarians, and we are, in fact, making it comfortable for them here. And so that's how it is a threat to us, more so even because we don't even know what we're dealing with. I mean, I talked about the Muslim Brotherhood. They are considered a terrorist organization and they are banned in Egypt and in almost every single Arab country, but not in the UK, not in Canada, not in America, not in Australia. Like, we don't know what we're dealing with here. They have their political ideology hidden under, religious freedom, practicing our faith, and they hide under that, and people can't tell the difference. So when they run around with their hijab day in our high schools and in our universities, encouraging girls to put hijab on, they think, oh, this is just a cultural thing. They don't understand that this is modesty culture. This is purity culture. Girls are thrown in prison in Iran. Girls are killed in Saudi Arabia, all over the world over hijab. even in America, even in Canada. We had a young girl named Aksa Parvez, 16 years old, in Mississauga, Ontario, that was killed by her father and her brother because she refused to wear hijab. And now suddenly we have no idea what the hijab is, and we're just plastering it on every flat surface and we're celebrating it. Like, we have this moral confusion that we wouldn't have if it was coming from fundamentalist Christianity, for example. We know what we're looking at and we respond accordingly. But when it's coming from Islam, suddenly, people don't know what they're seeing.
Can you
And
connect that with the critical race theory ideology? Like, why are we afraid to criticize Islam or Islamic practices?
that's exactly right there is the biggest problem. The fact that we are afraid to criticize it. The word Islamophobia was created by Islamists, and it's genius. It was created to sound like xenophobia, homophobia, all these other words that were good. It's good to be against these things, right? And so it got the progressives, who are now who I call the useful idiots, to create this bottom up blasphemy law. They're policing each other and us to the point that we can't even speak about our own traumas. We can't even speak about the realities of what Islam has done to people all over the world, is doing to people all over the world, because we have these useful idiots from their ivory towers that know nothing about anything that are silencing us with this bludgeon of a word that was created by Islamists, created specifically to silence us over here, because they can't throw us in prison the way they do in, Afghanistan or Jordan or Somalia or everywhere else, right? So they have to find a way, like, how are we going to silence people in the West? So they created this term, and it works like a charm. And that's why you'll see people, for example, in Charlottesville, when you saw those anti-Semitic monsters walking through the streets talking about Jews will not replace us, everybody reacted accordingly. But every single year, the streets are filled in every capital city throughout the West during the Al-Aqsa marches, where you have people screaming Khaybar Khaybar, which is basically a call to the genocide of Jewish people, but it's in Arabic,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so suddenly they're like, oh, well, we don't know what that means, right? They're calling intifada, globalize the intifada. Well, we don't know what that means. That can just be resistance. Like, suddenly they don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what they're dealing with when it's coming from an Islamic context, which I don't think that they don't know what they're dealing with. I think that they do
And why do
very
you
well know what
yeah,
they're dealing with, but
why
they're
do you
too afraid to name it and to counter it.
well, another word that came to my attention yesterday, and I think you and I were at the same meeting, and that's the word jihad. I was shown today
Mhm.
that jihad is a word in Ontario textbooks that is said to mean a spiritual struggle, period.
So I like to remind people that Mein Kampf also means my struggle.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, jihad means struggle, sure. But words have context, words have meaning. Ask any Muslim what jihad means. Not a single one of them is going to tell you it means spiritual struggle, unless they are somebody who is specifically trying to lie to you and deceive you, which would probably, unfortunately, not be too rare. But the word jihad means holy war. It's in reference to fighting for the sake of Allah, fighting fi sabilillah, to make this whole world Islamic, to make this whole world Muslim. Convert or die. That's the whole ideology of jihad.
Two of the people that I've had on for webinars on a similar topic are Elaine Ellinger and Dr. Andrew Boston. Both of them speak about the doctrine of Islam. So even though we speak about the distinction between Islam, the religion, and Islamists, they point out the doctrine, the Quran, is loaded with anti-Semitic and other anti-humane concepts. Can you address that? Do you speak about that? Do you see it as a huge distinction, or do you think we have a bigger problem?
No, I 100% agree with them. People use the term Islamism sometimes to try and separate Islam from this, political terroristic ideology. So they give it a new name of Islamism. And I always like to ask, well, who's the prophet of Islamism? What's the holy book of Islamism, right? What is the doctrine of Islamism? It's all Islam. It's the same book. So yes, individual Muslims themselves can choose to deny these aspects of their religion, and there are many of them. You and I know them through the Clarity Coalition. We work with lots of Reform Muslims who say, I don't believe in all the anti-Semitism that is in religion. I don't believe in all of these, convert or die aspects that are in my religion. They know it's in their religion, but they're choosing to ignore those parts. Those Muslims exist. If you are the kind of Muslim who actively wants to spread Islam, whether it's through jihad or whether it's through using secular laws against themselves, whether it's through immigration, whether it's through government, whether it's through media, whether it, through education. There's so many ways of spreading Islam. It doesn't always have to be by the stabbings in the streets, or beheading teachers. There's many different ways of keeping people in control or afraid of criticizing Islam. And there are people that use dawah. Dawah is a way of basically encouraging people to become Muslim through cherry picking what you tell them, just telling them these parts or whitewashing the good parts or the bad parts to try and encourage people to become Muslim. So there's all sorts of ways of spreading Islam, right? And if you are the kind of Muslim who is going to be actively engaged in any of those methods, then you are what is called an Islamist. So there is a difference between the individual Muslims in that some are engaged in spreading Islam and some are not. However, as you said, the doctrine of Islam is very clear. The doctrine demands that every Muslim spread Islam.
I actually became aware of that after speaking to Elaine, who was actually in the chat or in the audience. So I draw that to everybody's attention as well. Ideology, bringing the ideology to the attention of the West. How will we do that? What do you recommend so that we can make more people, other than webinars like this, aware of this phenomenon? I understand the Muslim Brotherhood is really Islamism in suits. So we won't even see them. We won't know who they are. And they are practicing what could be called a stealth jihad, but they are in our institutions in significant numbers. How do we bring this forward?
That is the million-dollar question right there, Andrea. I would, it's not even just an issue that we have, in the far, like with the NDP. This is an issue that we have in our conservative government as well, right? They are everywhere. They are all over our educational institutions. They're all over our government. They are all over our media. They are all over our law enforcement, right? They have infiltrated everywhere. And this distinction between a Muslim and an Islamist is one that most people still don't understand. Whenever there's any kinds of criticism of these Islamists, it is immediately seen as racist, bigoted, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, if you look up the term Islamophobia, the definition of the term Islamophobia, they have included in the definition to say even criticizing political aspects of Islam. So even to criticize the fact that they are trying to spread their ideology is considered Islamophobia. So that's something that we have to start to just care less about. And I think you mentioned that at the beginning here. We need to not care anymore when people start to use these nonsensical terms that were created by our enemies. They were created by people who want you and me dead. So the fact that they would even use these terms is just embarrassing, to be perfectly honest. But we have to start to care less, and we shouldn't allow these words to silence us, and we have to keep on speaking. The problem is they are so ahead of us, and they have been building this infrastructure in our country for decades. So I liken it to the fact to look at Israel versus Gaza. What has Israel been doing, for the past 70 years? Excelling in medicine and in technology and in, security and in every aspect, right? Winning all of these Nobel Prizes. And what has been happening in Gaza? Building tunnels. That's what they've been doing, building tunnels that are more intricate than the New York City subway. And now we're coming forward at this point and saying, hey, guys, this is a lot of propaganda. You've been sold a lot of lies. None of this is based in historical fact, but it's like we're so late to the game. We haven't been wasting, or we haven't been spending all our time and money and energy in this. Now, I don't even want to call it propaganda. I want to call it this, in this anti-Semitic push against, who they view as their enemies, right? So we haven't been engaged in that work. Same thing here in Canada. We haven't been engaged in this. Islamists have been, in my book, I talk about how my mosque went from being a small mosque led by an imam from India who talked about love and being nice to your neighbors and all that stuff. And then he was replaced. This is when I was I'm talking 90s right now, right? Replaced by a Egyptian man whose wife came in full niqab, covered head to toe in black. And this Egyptian man came in, and suddenly everything was fire and brimstone. The mosque got huge. The school, the Islamic school just grew. Suddenly we had a secondary school. We had all of this money. We had all of this funding. Everything was changed to Arabic. No other languages were allowed anywhere in the mosque. You could see the shift in how everything just became much more, towards that, what at the time people were calling it Wahhabi ideology or Salafi ideology. It's all just Islamists. It's all just them spreading Islam in their way. So we watched this happen over the years, over the decades. And now we're coming up and we're like, hey guys, listen, you've all been duped for so long. Well, they spent billions of dollars and decades in this endeavor, and we have a big job ahead of us now. But it is critical. It is absolutely critical for people to pay attention to what's going on. And unfortunately, the Jewish people, as always, are the canaries in the coal mine here. But from October 7th, there is absolutely, it's mind-boggling how the anti-Semitism in our country, that it was just below the surface. And this just allowed them on October 8th to suddenly to show themselves, essentially.
Normalize.
But yeah, that's right. In fact, no more than normalized, it's like expected. I've never told anybody this yet, but I was standing with my daughter at a market where they were selling jewelry. And this woman was saying to the guy, the wings on the goddess Isis, Egyptian goddess. She said the wings on her kind of like, oh, this kind of looks kind of Nazi-ish, like this. It was like an arm cuff. And she said, you got to be careful with that. And then I said, oh my gosh, yeah, I never noticed that until you mentioned it. And then she's like, you really got to be careful these days. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And she goes, or maybe not. And I was like, what? How could you say that? And then she just like shuffles away from me. But like, you don't know me, I don't know you. You're talking to a random stranger in the street, and you think that I'm going to be okay with you saying, like, maybe it's not a big deal if we're wearing, Nazi symbols? Like, it was just shocking that it's become so normalized in our society, even though we know it's evil. Like, we're still... How are people stuck in this cognitive dissonance where they still recognize and they still understand and they still know what you just mentioned, all of this buildup to the Holocaust. Holocaust wasn't one day, right? All of this buildup, we know how it happened. We know we are living it today. People have said so many times, oh, what would I do if I were in Germany? What would I do if I were in Poland? Well, today's the day. Now answer that question for yourself. Like, this is your opportunity now to react because you're living it. We are experiencing it right now, but they somehow are on the wrong side of history. It really is perplexing.
We have to empower people and enlighten people, but it is a difficult battle. One of the things I've noticed is it's not subject to logic. When you're talking to people about this, logic doesn't help. Facts don't matter. It's very difficult to break through. So let me give you another scenario that I've seen. It has come to my attention through talking to mostly Muslim and ex-Muslim friends who are supportive of the Jewish community, that there's probably no mosque in Canada that hasn't become what you described. You described your own mosque. I had visited mosques 20 years ago that were open, but I'm hearing now there is no mosque that isn't going to be raging against Israel or raging against the Jews. And how do you confront that? And if you raise it with people, it is exactly what you said. You're then an Islamophobe. You're criticism is all directed in people's minds to one particular ethnic group, so you're racist or you're a bigot, it's impossible to have the conversation, right? How do we draw attention to the fact that we have centers of education and religious practice that are teaching people in our country to hate us?
They're teaching people in our country to hate us, and they are funding anybody who is supporting that idea. Our federal government is. So people like myself and Raheel Reza, the late Tariq Fatah, any Muslims or ex-Muslims who publicly are speaking up against this. Raheel Reza is the founder of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism. Any Muslims or ex-Muslims are speaking up against this. We're on the federal government website. There is a report there on the Islamophobia industry that was funded by our federal government, research that was done at McMaster University. We are listed there as the bad guys, so it is incredibly difficult for our voices to be heard, for us to break through, like I mentioned, the propaganda that they've been building for decades and billions of dollars being thrown into it. So all we can do is just keep on raising our voices. I totally agree with you that they can't be reached with reason, they can't be reached with logic, they can't be reached with history. But to be perfectly honest, they are their own worst enemies. I've spoken to so many people who used to be part of the pro-Palestine movement, and when they see how heartless and cruel and vicious their community is, it has made them take a step back and start to question what's going on. This can't this isn't something I want to be a part of. The way they were pulling down posters of people that were taken hostages by terrorists, babies that were taken hostages by terrorists, that's going to affect people. It's going to find its way into the humanity of a person. Even those who are indoctrinated. That's what happened to me on 9/11, right? That's what happened to so many Iraqis and Syrians when ISIS took over. You get to a point where you're like, this is absolutely heinous, and I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And the way these pro-Palestine people have been conducting themselves all over the world is turning a lot of their own supporters against them.
That's the most positive statement I've heard in a long time. I hope it's true, and I thank you for that. I want to switch a little bit because I think people will be interested in the fact that you've been to Israel and you went as a witness yourself. You went with a group that does talk about bridging Muslims and Jews. Can you tell us about the trip you were on and what were the highlights? What most interested you?
There were so many highlights. There were so many wonderful parts of the trip, but it was a Holocaust education trip. So it was incredibly difficult, incredibly emotionally draining. I mean, we were visiting Yad Vashem, talking about history. And then the next day, we're going to the Nova Festival Memorial.
Wow.
And it's like you are, you know, it's not history. This is real life. I'm seeing bomb shelters with, Smurfs and other characters painted on them so that in the playground when kids are playing, that they have a place to run to. Every home has to have a bomb shelter in it, and usually it's the children's bedroom so that they don't have to be disrupted. It's just, you're listening to Holocaust survivors talking about, escaping Poland and coming and finding Israel and finding the homeland. You're listening to people who, survived the Farhud in Iraq and were thrown out of their homes in Egypt, and, from Jewish people who were living in Yemen and Russia and all over the world, coming and sharing their stories and talking about how this tiny piece of land was their only sanctuary, the only place that they could come to feel safe. And they're saying this as we are standing in a country where every single home has to have a bomb shelter, where they're living under constant threat. So even that one tiny little piece of land where they felt was it's sanctuary, it's their homeland. They can return home, they can be safe here, they can't even be safe there. So it's this constant frustration of we don't want Jews in our country, but we also don't want them in their own country either. Like it's what do you want?
And
where do you want the Jewish people to go?
you can confirm that this is not a war about that piece of land either.
I 100% can confirm that. Absolutely. And there are 57 Muslim majority countries, right? They didn't just become that way overnight. They became that way through colonization. The state of Israel is the first example that we have seen. And I've spoken to Yazidis and Kurds and Druze and so many other minority groups from the Middle East who look to Israel and say, wow, you did it. You got your homeland back. Like that is amazing and impressive. This fight isn't specific. It is not about the land at all. It is about the destruction of Jewish people, not just the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Jewish people. That is the goal and always has been the goal. And they have never wavered in that. If you go back all the way back to the 1920s, there's an incredible book that I recommend everybody read. It's called The War of Return. And in that, I'm thinking of Eve Barlow, but she's not the author. Enat Wilf. Enat Wilf is the author.
Right.
And she used to be one of those two-state solution. They just want their homeland. They just want to live in peace. They just, they're just like us. And then she, through all of her education and research, has now finally understood that that was never the goal. The goal was never for them to have a place where they could live. The goal was for Jewish people to never have a place where they could live. That was always the goal. And is an Islamist issue. And this is why in the Hamas charter, they specifically talk about this. And this is why in Iran, for example, they will scream, death to Israel, death to America. This is why you'll hear the same swearing at Yahud everywhere, not just in the Arab world, but in Pakistan and Indonesia and in countries that they have Islam, but they don't have any history. They don't have any connection to the Arab world, but it comes through in the religion. The religion, as I mentioned in my book, hates all non-Muslims, but of course, there's a special extra vicious hate for Jewish people.
You're right that it's not just the religion, but these are countries, some you mentioned, that don't even have Jews. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, and Hirsi Ali made that very clear in her first book, that she's in Somalia, there are no Jews, but her grandmother blamed everything wrong in the country on the Jews.
Everything wrong in the country, everything, my aunt, when we were going to the market picking cucumbers, she's like, oh, the cucumbers are so small this year. It's the Jews. They're putting cancer in the vegetables, making them small. I'm like, what? Like, it's just everything. Doesn't matter what it is. It's the Jews' fault. And you see this on social media now, too. Like, it's so normalized for them to blame the Jews for everything that they think that this is like normal, discourse. And then they write this kind of stuff on social media showing how ridiculous they are. But yeah, this is it. If the water, turn on the tap, if the water doesn't come out, it's the Jews.
Right. Right. So what's the first is probably the wrong word. What would be a major strategy or action that you see we should take in Canada? Do you have thoughts about how we turn this around? Even if it's going to take a generation or two, where do we start?
Yes, I believe that the only way forward is French style secularism. That is the only way forward. I promise you. I know religious people don't want to hear this, but it is the only way. When Quebec tries to do this, to say things about, public servants not being allowed to wear any kind of religious paraphernalia, everybody calls them racist, everybody calls them bigots, everybody calls them intolerant, et cetera, but they know what's up. They understand that as soon as you open the door to quote unquote religious freedom, you're going to have these Islamists running through the door. That's what's going to happen. And I went to one of these Islamic schools. It's just a center for indoctrination. It's just a center for hate, right? We were told how to act when the inspectors would come. We were given books that we'd never seen before put on our desks when the inspectors would come. The whole thing is a farce, right? They know exactly what they're doing, but if they get to have their own schools and it's under this whole, freedom of religion, oh, it's an independent school, oh, it's faith-based, blah, 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 then they're going to use it to spread their ideology. As we can't say Christians are free to do whatever they want in Canada, Jews are free to do whatever they want in Canada, but Muslims can't. We can't do that, right? Because you just can't. So the secularism that we have to choose is the French style secularism of no religions allowed in any public. Do you remember years and years ago how there was that woman in niqab that wanted to go and get her citizenship, and they were saying, well, that's not
Yeah.
allowed because your face is covered, and then it was like, oh, you're all Islamophobes, blah blah blah. And in the end, we changed our laws for a woman who wasn't even Canadian yet. Like, that's what we do. We roll out the red carpet. We make it easy for them. We're not even putting up a fight. We spent 30 years getting Christianity out of schools only to roll out the red carpet for Islam, to have these prayer rooms in all of our schools and to be spreading their ideology. Dawah is happening. You have the national anthem of Canada being sung in Arabic on October 7th.
For
They
those
know
who
what
don't
they're
know,
doing.
this just happened in the Toronto school, for those of you not in Toronto to be aware of this.
Yes, and the stories are endless of what's happening in our school systems because of the fact that we have opened the doors to Islam. We have opened the doors to Muslims. We're very aware when it's Christian fundamentalists trying to get in the door. We're like, no, 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 that's not allowed, But when it's Muslims, it's like, well, that's their culture. So that's what we have to stop.
It
We
sounds
have to
like
stop treating religions
right,
differently.
but it does sound like it's a bit of a thin line, because I believe that the law in Quebec to ban the symbols really had to do with their desire to ban the burqa, to ban full face covering. And so
What?
they banned, the necklace you and I are wearing.
That's
Nobody
okay.
cared.
It's a price we have to pay.
Yes.
I'm saying that you just we have to be careful. This is very important now. We know how they're infiltrating, and we have to know how to react. This French style secularism it's not going to be everybody's favorite thing, but it is the only way to stop these Islamists from continuing their work.
What would you do, though, with Islamic schools? Because they don't have to conform to, I guess, public school regulations. As long
No,
as
they do
they're
not.
teaching the public school curriculum, they can still introduce all this religious fanaticism.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the school that I went to.
Mhm.
Right. And we didn't learn any academia. I spoke to a young man on my podcast who went through imam indoctrination in Edmonton, in Alberta. That's supposed to be our conservative province, right? Where he left there not knowing how to write a sentence. They don't teach us academia. They teach us how to be soldiers, how to spread Islam, whether it's through, an Islamist manner or whether it's through more, violent means. But this is what it's all about. It's how are you going to spread Islam? And so we have to, when you ask me what I'm going to do about Islamic schools, I would say shut them all down. But there's no way you can shut down all the Islamic schools without also shutting down the Jewish schools and also shutting down the Christian schools. And so
Right.
people don't want to do that. They're saying, well, this is our country and we want to have the freedom to practice our faith. And I understand that. But as long as you have that door open and as long as people can't understand the difference between faith and ideology, then we're going to continue to have this problem. Now, France has found a really good way of dealing with this, and every imam that speaks at any mosque in France needs to be licensed by the government, and they are vetted. And there's people don't like this either because they're like, oh, they don't have their freedom and their mosque to say what they want. No, you don't. You don't have the freedom to talk about anti-Semitism and to talk about homophobia and to talk about killing infidels. And no, you don't have that freedom. So we don't do anything. I mean, the YouTube videos of the imams, what they say in Canada is like
Well, there's a whole
unbelievable.
trail of them. There's almost a conference a week with some imam coming from somewhere out of the country as a guest speaker. And if you look them up, they are practically on the wanted list by camera or memory, the organizations which track and analyze what they're saying. Every one of them is coming full of vitriol and hatred, and they're speaking all the time across the country.
Absolutely. I heard one imam from Victoria, BC, who was talking about if you try to kill a Jew, it's a win-win. If you try to kill him and you kill him, that's great. And if you don't kill him, but you end up dying, that's also great because you're going to go to heaven. You're going to get your 72 virgins. So you know what, guys? Go for it. And this guy is still an imam, right? Like, there's no consequences to calling for the genocide of people.
And at the same time, you're trying to rescue young people who want to leave Islam, who live in countries where, as an apostate, they could be killed. So, my first question is, are you under threat? How are you managing personally?
Yeah. So before I opened my mouth for the very first time, before I went in front of a camera for the very first time, I was fully aware um, that I was taking a huge risk. I mean, I lived, breathed, grew up with, was married to, had a child with this ideology. So I understand how vicious it is and how there's just zero humanity in this ideology. You know, my mother threatened to kill me, and she would have had she had the means to do it. And it's all very, logical as far as they're concerned because it's following their faith, it's following their doctrine, it's following their ideology. And as far as my mom was concerned, if I left Islam and I became an infidel, then that would be her fault because she raised an infidel daughter. So she had to make sure that I was killed before I became an infidel so that she's not punished for the rest of eternity. So it's just like a heartless, cruel, almost calculated decision. And it's the same calculated viciousness that they have against every other non-Muslim. So having been raised in that, I understand it so well. And so I knew when I spoke up that I was going to be putting myself in the line of fire. But I also knew how important it was that people hear the voice of a person who has experienced this, a person who wore niqab, head to toe covered in black, wore the gloves, even had my eyes covered, a person who went to Islamic schools, a person who's lived in Egypt and in Qatar, right? A person who speaks Arabic as their first language. I needed to get my voice out there. There were voices of people who are being shut down because, oh, you're just white. Oh, you're just Jewish. Oh, you're just American. Oh, you're just an Islamophobe. Oh, you're just a bigot. So I needed to speak up because then at least they wouldn't be able to attack my immutable characteristics before they were forced to engage with the arguments that I was making. That's why it was like I was compelled to do this. It was imperative that I do this. I was watching my country commit social suicide, and I felt like I had to do something about it.
You are speaking for all of us. You are a hero to all of us because you are putting your life at risk. And I think that's hard for people to appreciate that in Canada, it could be that much of a risk, but I believe it is. And that you could be threatened. Maybe you are on a regular basis threatened. I don't know. I hope you have security. And for sure, because you have children, I'm sure you're very conscious of that.
I do the best I can, but I just would like a shout out to our law enforcement in Canada that even when I show them credible threats that include things like my address or my daughter's names, they say to me, well, let us know when a crime happens.
After the fact. Let me give you a moment to talk about the Clarity Coalition so that people here are aware of the work you're doing that is quite significant. Want to
So
tell
the
us
Clarity
and it is? Yeah, go ahead.
The Clarity Coalition is a group. So the director is myself and Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is a practicing Muslim man from Phoenix, Arizona. So the fact that it's directed by a Muslim and an ex-Muslim just shows you that humans can work together towards a common goal, even when we have two completely different ways of living our lives and belief systems. It is it's a global coalition of people from all across the world, Muslims, ex-Muslim, Jews, Christians, Hindus, atheists. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on either, or where in the middle you fit. As long as you're concerned about this Islamist threat to Western civilization, then you are welcome to join us and to help us in this fight. So we have journalists, we have politicians, we have activists, we have all sorts of people who are, engaged in this work alone all across the globe. But I really believed that if we could link hands together and support each other, if we could, instead of feeling disheartened and scared to speak up because you're raising your head all alone. If we all work together and support each other, we would be so much stronger. And I'm happy to report that it's such an incredibly, not only functionally, productive space for this work, but emotionally too. Just to have people that you're meeting with and that you're speaking with and that you can share your ideas and thoughts with, who understand what you're going through and who can finish your sentences. And if I can just say, we've had so many people from the Jewish community join us recently because they felt the same betrayal after October 7th that ex-Muslims have been feeling for a long time. And that's denial of our trauma. That's excusing of our trauma. And that's like celebrating our tormentors. And we really thought that we would find a safe place or, a compassionate shoulder on the left with liberals, with open-minded people, with, freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And to find out that these people that we have been uplifting for so many years were so quickly turned against us because they called us Islamophobes and bigots and whatever, so we couldn't even tell our own stories. We really saw the Jewish community go through that after October 7th. How they were so quickly, after you spent decades, like this friend of mine, Carolyn Fine from Portland, Oregon, who spent her whole life uplifting minority groups in Portland, only on October 8th to find Palestinian flags popping up all over her neighborhood. October 8th, people were just taken hostage. Bodies are still warm. The videos of what was happening were still happening. We didn't even know how many people were killed or how many hostages were taken. And they are
Right.
celebrating. They're celebrating this atrocity. As she's bleeding, she's seeing everyone in her city celebrating the people who caused this trauma to her community.
Yeah, October 7th gave permission for everybody to come out of their hole and be anti-Semitic. So several people have asked how they can join, how they can become involved. Do you want to tell people what they need to do to join?
Yes, please go to claritycoalition.org, and there is a button there that says join us, and just click on that and we welcome you.
That's great.